And so from my standpoint, there's a recognition, I think, or of the importance of the fundamental right to vote, but it's not something that I think we can sort of articulate in an intellectual way. From my perspective, it comes from the civil rights movement. And as you all heard, I worked in Montgomery, Alabama, and kind of started my own career when I was in college, focusing on this sort of almost developing an obsession about how we continue the gains that have been made over the past decades with regards to civil rights. And I was really struck by the civil rights. If you study the classical civil rights movement, it starts with really Brown versus Board, and of course there's much before that. But it starts with Brown versus Board and access to education, and it ends with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. That the Voting Rights Act was really the culmination of all of the battles, all of the fights, all of the deaths, all of the martyrs, all the individuals who gave up so much during the civil rights movement. The crowning achievement of all of that work was access to education and equal education, but also that Voting Rights Act that was so crucial that it was a separate piece of legislation from the Civil Rights Act. So recognizing that, I moved to Montgomery, Alabama, and sort of said, you know, what could we do today to further the work of the civil rights activists of the past? And while I think fighting for equal access to education is a piece of that, and continuing the promise of Brown versus Board of Education, which we all know has been deteriorating over time since really that decision came down and the 1960s saw the wave of integration or pushing for integration. Similarly, just like there's been efforts to roll back education access and access to education since the civil rights movement, there have been similar efforts to roll back voting rights and access to the vote. And that is where I think I sort of come down at, that we've seen this great achievement of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. For the first time in our country's history, a law saying you can't make any laws that abridge the right to vote based on race or color. And then you see almost instantly several different states starting to implement laws that push back on, make it more difficult to have access to the vote. And when we get down to who makes decisions in this country and who has power in this country, it's of course determined by the voters, but who votes in this country is determined by the laws surrounding elections. And that's where the Voting Rights Act comes in, to sort of recognize nationally that we need a federal protection to make sure states are not limiting access to the vote. Almost immediately after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, we see several different pieces of legislation on the state level being enacted to, again, make it harder to vote. And I'm going to talk more about that, and that brings us to Michigan today. But just to take one further step back, the history of voting in this country is one of, there's actually this great book by Alexander Kaysar called The Right to Vote. And what he sort of lays out the history of voting, and he lays it out in terms of waves, and recognizes that when our country was founded, we sort of were founded with this idea of freedom and access to democracy, but of course the vote was explicitly only given to white male landowners of a certain age, over the age of 21. And that sort of was the way things were. There were efforts to expand the vote, but it really, of course, was not until after the Civil War where you see the passage of the Civil Rights or Civil War amendments that opened up access to the vote and said you could not deny someone's right to vote based on race. So you had, in his view, a war and then a recognition of the need to increase access to the vote. And then immediately after that, in the 1880s, we saw the election for the first time to Congress of African Americans. I think 16 or 17 African American men from the South were elected in the 1880s. And then almost immediately after that, in 1890, you see not only the passage of Jim Crow laws and other things happening throughout the South, but the implementation of poll taxes, literacy tests, felon disenfranchisement laws, and registration laws, the idea that you have to register before you vote. That came out of this sort of era in the 1890s that was really a part of a package of laws passed state by state to make it more difficult, particularly for African Americans to vote, but make it more difficult to vote generally for many of the new individuals who are now voting after the Civil War. So I say that to sort of paint this picture of, you have the Civil War, increasing access to the vote, and then this passage on the state level, at the federal level, and then the passage on the state level of these laws to, again, limit access. that sort of culminated in Jim Crow. And then you have World War I, also another war, and then immediately following that in Britain and the United States is expansion of the franchise to women. So again, another war, another expansion of the franchise to more individuals, particularly women, through the passage of, or through the amending of the Constitution. There were other things that happened to add more from a campaign finance standpoint, make it more difficult for women to run for office now that they could have the right to vote. So the pushback on the state level came from campaign finance laws that made it more difficult or impossible for women to actually run for office, even though they now had the right to vote. And then you, of course, had the World War II Civil Rights Movement, passage of the Voting Rights Act. And that's where, again, you see this federal effort to expand access to the vote through the Voting Rights Act, and then on the state level, small state laws being passed, like more identification requirements, more stringent laws saying you can't vote if you've been convicted of certain crimes. On the state level, making it more hard to vote, and in particular, making it harder to vote if you are a citizen with limited English proficiency. So then after that, in the 1970s, there was, of course, another war in the late 60s, early 70s, and then you saw the amending of the Constitution again to make it so that younger people could vote, to reduce the voting age to 18. And then you had states, again, through redistricting, altering certain ways that the districts were drawn to make it more difficult, or basically create a district so that no matter how many people of the African American community, the Latino community voted, they would still be in the minority and not be able to elect their candidates of choice. And so, I'm just gonna move this over a little bit because it's kind of hard for me to. Okay.
Any questions?
Yeah.
I mean, how did the pushback against women go in the 20s?
There were for the first time in our country's history, there were these campaign finance regulations that really were emerged out of the early 1900s in an effort to make it illegal for corporations to give. But what they saw was basically women were not able to run because they weren't able to, at that time, raise money from certain individuals. So oftentimes their husbands would raise money, and so that there were laws passed to make it more difficult for other people to raise money for them. And it was sort of one of the ways in which it was, there were other some more, I think, nuanced laws that were passed to make it more difficult for women to have access in other ways to running for office, but it was sort of one of the effects after the 19th Amendment was enacted to make it more difficult for women to participate in politics. But I guess the interesting thing is that there's this pushback, as we see, this pendulum swinging, as we see in many areas of our legal system and our policies, where you have increase in access and then a limitation on, and it's usually an increase on access comes on the federal level, and the limitation, the pushback, comes on the state level from states trying to make it more difficult for that access to be achieved. And so I say that to really, in answering the question, what are the Voting Rights Act battles today? What is our, how can we continue the gains that have been made to make voting access more of a reality in this country? The answer has to be on the state level, because at the federal level, every time there's been this push forward, the states push back, whether it's through increased registration requirements, increased poll taxes, literacy tests, or whatnot. It's usually at the state level where we oftentimes see that pushback. Now, it's taken a different role in modern days where you actually, really after the 2000 election, the way we view voting and elections has completely been altered in many ways because really of Katherine Harris. And whereas in the past, state action has come through laws being passed, and the recognition of what states are doing to address voting has come through what laws they've passed or not passed, felon disenfranchisement laws and that sort of thing. In 2000, we saw nationally, really for the first time, how an administrator in that Secretary of State's role can make decisions that, even if the federal and state laws are